the forgotten empire of Leavenworth, where inmates once ruled the guards. Once hailed as the fortress of federal justice, Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas became something else entirely. A living empire run not by the warden, but by the men behind its walls. For decades, it stood as the symbol of American punishment, housing some of the most dangerous minds in history. But behind the concrete and iron, a different government took shape, one that operated with its own rules, economy, and power. This is the story of how Leavenworth, one of America's first federal prisons, slipped into the hands of its inmates, and what it took to take it back. Disclaimer: this story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. The fortress that forgot who was in charge, they called it the Big House. Not just for its size, but for its dominance. Leavenworth wasn't built to reform men. It was built to control them. When the massive stone walls rose over the Kansas plains in the early 1900s, it was America's answer to chaos. The country needed a symbol, a fortress that told criminals and citizens alike that federal power had a face, and that face was Leavenworth. Constructed with granite walls thicker than most medieval castles, its layout mimicked a military base. Guard towers on every corner, long cell blocks like barracks, and a central dome that watched over everything. But over time, control slipped. By the 1930s, reports from prison inspectors described a strange phenomenon: guards afraid to enter certain tiers without inmate permission. Inside the walls, a hidden economy thrived. Men who arrived broken by the system quickly learned that real authority didn't wear a badge, it wore tattoos. According to Bureau of Prisons Archives, Leavenworth had become a place where inmates ran gambling operations, extortion rings, and even construction crews. In one notorious account, a guard admitted that prisoners handled more of the day-to-day management than we did. The official hierarchy was collapsing under its own weight. The warden's office still sent memos to Washington about maintaining discipline, but those who lived inside knew a different truth. Leavenworth had become a self-contained city-state. And like every empire, it had rulers. The inmates called them the elders, men who had survived multiple bids and built reputations that inspired both fear and loyalty. They settled disputes, organized trades, and dictated who could walk the yard. When the guards weren't watching, or even when they were, the elders decided what justice looked like inside those walls. Inmates worked on prison industries by day, making furniture, license plates, and machinery for the federal government, but by night they built fortunes from cigarettes, gambling debts, and favors. Weapons were forged from scrap metal stolen from workshop. Hoarded sugar turned into moonshine. Even cell assignments could be bought and sold. A 1940 investigative report noted something the Bureau found deeply unsettling: the inmates have developed a level of organization typically found in outside communities. It wasn't just a prison anymore. It was a city, and the guards were the foreigners. Leavenworth became infamous not only for its inmates, gangsters like Carl Panzram and Machine Gun Kelly, but for its strange balance of fear and routine. Guards learned to look away when certain things happened. Minor infractions disappeared in exchange for peace. Inmates who could maintain order were quietly tolerated because they made the job easier. But the illusion of control couldn't last forever. In the mid-1950s, a riot warning spread through the cell block. Whispers said the elders were losing grip over younger inmates, men more impulsive, less disciplined, unwilling to follow old prison law. Guards tightened patrols, but it was already too late. The balance of power had shifted again, this time toward chaos. According to news reports from the Kansas City Star, an argument between two rival groups turned into an all-out siege that lasted 3 days. Fires raged in the industrial workshop. Guards were held hostage in Cell Block D. The warden refused to negotiate with the inmate council, a move that led to bloodshed before federal reinforcements restored order. The aftermath revealed the truth. The elders had been running everything from contraband pipelines to payroll kickback. They controlled communications, labor assignments, even the kitchen. The guards had been living in their empire, not the other way around. In the decades that followed, Leavenworth's reputation changed from a model of federal authority to a warning. Lawmakers began to ask how a place designed for total control could lose it so completely. Prison experts pointed to a single word: complacency. The system had relied on the illusion of obedience while corruption took root in every corner. By the 1970s, the Bureau of Prisons moved to modernize the facility. Surveillance systems replaced guard towers. New wardens promised reform. But old habits don't die easily. Leavenworth's underground order adapted, shifting from violence to influence, from brute force to bureaucracy. They learned that in modern prisons, the smartest inmate isn't the strongest, it's the one who can manipulate the system from within. As one former Leavenworth officer later admitted in a 1990 interview, "We thought we were running the prison. But looking back, I think the prison was running us." That quiet confession marked the end of an era, and the beginning of something darker. Because Leavenworth wasn't just a place anymore. It was a legacy. And every empire, even a forgotten one, leaves behind its ghosts. The rise of the underground government. Leavenworth's transformation didn't happen overnight, it unfolded like a quiet coup. No gunfire. No speeches. Just deals made in the dark. By the 1960s, the stone fortress that once symbolized federal dominance had become a kingdom of its own. Guards clocked in every morning, unaware, or unwilling to admit, that they were walking into a system already governed by a shadow regime. The elders, those veteran inmates who had survived decades of time, realized something profound: violence only attracted attention. Influence, however, could last forever. And so, the empire evolved. The birth of a hidden bureaucracy. The turning point came with the expansion of prison industries. Programs that gave inmates access to tools, machines, and limited movement. To Washington, it was rehabilitation. To Leavenworth's underground network, it was infrastructure. Workshops became trading posts. Supply chains inside the walls started resembling the black markets outside them. A man assigned to the laundry could hide cash or deliver messages. Someone in the kitchen could control food portions, trading bread or meat for favors. The print shop became the hub, forging passes, altering paperwork, and smuggling letters that bypassed official mail channels. One inmate, whose identity remains sealed in Bureau of Prisons files, was reportedly referred to by guards as the clerk who ran the city. He controlled inmate rosters, supply lists, and assignment approvals. Nothing moved without his signature. He didn't need to fight, he just needed to delay a form. That's how Leavenworth's new government was born, through paperwork, not power plays. According to a 1973 internal audit, later cited by the Topeka Capital Journal, guards routinely found that inmate-made documentation had been mixed with official prison record. In simple terms, the inmates had learned to manage the system better than the staff. The currency of power money in prison doesn't look like money outside. At Leavenworth, cigarettes were once worth more than gold. Every economy needs a standard, and in Leavenworth's underground world, a pack of Camels or a pouch of Bugler tobacco became the dollar bill of the block. A single cigarette could buy information. A carton could buy protection. But the real evolution came when drugs entered the picture. In the 1980s, with narcotics flooding into American streets, prisons became the new frontier for distribution. Leavenworth, strategically located in the heart of Kansas, was perfectly positioned for smuggling, hidden in legal mail, guard deliveries, or truck shipments from prison industries. Investigations later revealed that cartels used inmates to maintain networks inside federal prisons, and Leavenworth was no exception. The same walls meant to isolate criminals had turned into communication hubs for organized crime. And yet, the guards rarely saw it. Because order on the surface was perfect. The yards were calm. The workshops ran smoothly. The warden received glowing reports about efficiency. But beneath that order, the underground government operated like a corporation. There were ranks, managers, bookkeepers, and enforcers. When someone disobeyed, punishment didn't come from a guard's baton. It came quietly, through withheld meals, canceled favors, or worse, a cell transfer that meant certain retaliation. A former inmate who later testified under protection described it bluntly. You didn't need to stab nobody at Leavenworth to make a point. You just had to make sure their name disappeared from the list. The inmates who wrote the rules. It's impossible to talk about Leavenworth's inner empire without mentioning its code, an unwritten constitution that dictated behavior more rigidly than any federal policy. Rule 1. Don't involve the guards. Rule 2. Handle your own problems. Rule 3. Loyalty over logic. New arrivals were quickly introduced to this world. Older inmates served as sponsors, teaching them what to say, where to stand, and whom not to cross. They weren't mentoring, they were indoctrinating. Those who refused to play along faced isolation not from the administration, but from their peers. Refusing a favor could mean no access to the phone, no safety on the yard, or no help during a lockdown. In a place like Leavenworth, where survival was a group project, that was a death sentence in slow motion. By the late 1980s, inmate councils, unofficial governing bodies, handled everything from racial disputes to contraband pricing. Guards occasionally used them as intermediaries to keep peace, a practice quietly condemned by Washington but tolerated on the ground. The irony was stunning. The United States government had built a fortress to contain criminals and ended up negotiating with them for peace inside it. The collapse of control. Everything has a breaking point. In 1995, an internal memo leaked from the Bureau of Prisons warned that Leavenworth's informal inmate hierarchy has grown into a structure that challenges official command. The phrase, "challenges official command," sent shockwaves through Washington, bureaucratic language for "we've lost control again." What followed was a sweeping reform, new wardens, new rules, and a wave of high-security transfers meant to scatter the most influential inmates across the country. Some went to Marion, some to Florence, others to the new, supermax facilities that promised absolute isolation. But Leavenworth's legend didn't vanish. It echoed. Former guards described the cleanup as a political theater. The real problem, they said, wasn't the inmates, it was the system that let them build kingdoms inside cages. As one former officer told the Kansas City Star, "You can move men. You can move gangs. But you can't move a culture." And that culture, born behind the granite walls of Leavenworth, still lingers in the DNA of every American prison that came after it. Because what started as a fortress of punishment became a masterclass in power. The inmates learned that control isn't about strength, it's about systems. Leavenworth taught them how to build both. The Crackdown, Washington's war inside Leavenworth. By the mid-1990s, the storm clouds had gathered over Leavenworth. The quiet empire that had ruled from within was finally being noticed from above. Federal reports were piling up, headlines were growing darker, and whispers from Congress hinted at something unthinkable, a federal investigation into a federal prison. Leavenworth had crossed a line. The question now wasn't if Washington would strike back, it was how hard. The spark that lit the fuse. It began, as most collapses do, with one small mistake. An intercepted letter, ordinary at first glance, concealed coded financial transactions between inmates and contacts outside the walls. The document linked money transfers, drug orders, and even bribes involving lower-level staff. When investigators traced it back, the web reached far deeper than anyone expected. A Justice Department memo later confirmed that contraband, narcotics, and even classified documents had moved through inmate-controlled channels, all under the watch of a system that believed it was in control. To the Department of Justice, this wasn't just corruption. It was humiliation. In a scathing 1996 report, federal investigators declared Leavenworth a compromised institution. Those words, sterile, bureaucratic, cold, hid what everyone on the inside already knew. The inmates had built a kingdom so strong that even Washington's reach had struggled to pierce it. But this time, the Bureau wasn't coming to negotiate. It was coming to reclaim. Operation Clean Sweep. The official name sounded harmless. Operation Clean Sweep. Inside the prison walls, it was remembered as something else entirely: the Purge. Teams from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the DEA, and the FBI arrived under secrecy. The warden received a coded message days before: prepare for inspection. What followed was less inspection and more invasion. Before dawn, tactical units stormed the cell block. Black boots on steel stairs. Keys clanging. Lights flooding cells that hadn't seen brightness in years. Dozens of inmates were dragged from their bunks, restrained, and transferred out of state before sunrise. Some vanished into the federal system, reappearing months later in isolation units at Marion, Terre Haute, and Florence ADX, the new supermax fortress built specifically to hold the men Leavenworth could no longer contain. For guards, it was chaos. For the Bureau, it was cleansing. For the inmates, it was war. The warden's dilemma. At the center of it all stood Warden Samuel R. Keating, a career official who inherited a prison that was already bleeding control. Keating had arrived months before the operation, hand-picked by Washington for his record of restoring order in broken institutions. He was calm, clinical, and famously unshakable, a man who saw prisons not as moral battlegrounds, but as systems that needed maintenance. But Leavenworth wasn't a system anymore. It was a storm with walls. When he ordered the first wave of lockdowns, entire wings erupted. Inmates refused meals. Some set fires in protest. Others banged on cell doors in rhythm, a haunting, metallic drumbeat that echoed through the night. Keating addressed his officers in the chapel that morning. "We've allowed the walls to listen to the wrong voices," he said. "Starting today, we take back the sound." It was a powerful speech, but power in Leavenworth had never been about speeches. It was about who could move unseen. The hidden resistance. Washington underestimated one thing: you can relocate bodies, but not influence. Even as the Bureau dismantled the known leadership, smaller factions began to rise in the shadows, smarter, quieter, more adaptive. They no longer controlled guards through intimidation. They did it through cooperation. According to a 1998 Associated Press report, inmate liaisons began offering to help staff manage prison routines, acting as translators between volatile cell blocks and administration. It looked like peace, but beneath it the old code lived on. They weren't rebuilding a government. They were rebuilding control through compliance. One correctional officer, quoted anonymously, described it chillingly. "They stopped fighting us. They started helping us. That's when I knew they were winning again." This new strategy, dubbed shadow diplomacy by prison researchers, allowed the underground order to survive beneath the surface of reform. Instead of gangs, there were committees. Instead of contraband, there were discrepancies. Instead of riots, there was silence. Leavenworth had evolved again, becoming not a battleground, but a chessboard. When Washington realized the truth by 2001, the Justice Department declared victory. Reports cited significant progress and stabilized management. Cameras had been installed. Transfers were complete. Reforms were showing results. But among veteran guards, the celebration felt hollow. They had seen too much, and knew too well that prisons don't change overnight. A retired sergeant told the Kansas Reflector in 2003, The paperwork said we won. The walls said otherwise. He wasn't wrong. Beneath the new order, inmate alliances remained invisible but intact, woven through favors, debts, and loyalties that no policy could erase. In the early 2000s, one final scandal proved the empire's ghost was still alive. A prison industry's supervisor was caught funneling inmate-made furniture to private buyers, off the books. The profits? Split between staff and inmates, just like the old days. History, it seemed, wasn't repeating itself at Leavenworth. It had never stopped. The cost of reclaiming power, the crackdown broke the structure but not the spirit. The mass transfers created a ripple effect, dispersing Leavenworth's culture into other institutions. Marion, Florence, Allenwood, Beaumont. Each of them would later report the same symptoms: organized inmate networks, black market trades, internal order among chaos. Leavenworth's infection had gone national. For Washington, the operation was a technical success. But behind the numbers and memos, the human cost was staggering. Over a dozen officers resigned, several inmates were killed or disappeared during transfers, and hundreds lost contact with families for months. To the system, those were statistics. To those inside, they were ghosts. The quiet after the storm, when the lights finally dimmed, Leavenworth stood silent. The workshops were empty. The yards deserted. The sound of metal clanging, once a daily symphony, had become a memory. But silence in Leavenworth had never meant peace. It meant survival. A young inmate once said to a reporter from the Wichita Eagle, "Leavenworth's not a prison anymore. It's a reminder of what happens when people start believing they can own a system built to own them." That quote became the closing line of a 2004 documentary, and the unofficial epitaph for the forgotten empire that once ruled behind those stone walls. Because no matter how many times the Bureau rewrote its rules, one truth remained carved in the soul of Leavenworth: power, once tasted, never really leaves. Echoes of power, the legacy that still lives inside Leavenworth. Leavenworth never truly died. It simply went quiet. From the outside, the fortress still looms over the Kansas plains, a monument to order, justice, and control. The walls gleam pale under sunlight, the towers stand unmoving, and the flag above the gate still waves as if nothing ever changed. But those who've lived or worked inside know that silence isn't peace. It's memory. And in Leavenworth, memory is everything. The prison that refused to fade. When the Bureau of Prisons officially modernized Leavenworth in the early 2000s, it declared the facility reformed. Cameras lined every corridor. Guard rotations tightened. Communications were monitored, visits shortened, privileges cut. On paper, the old empire was gone. In reality, it had only gone underground, not in cells but in stories. Guards whispered about the old council, men who once ruled entire wings but now lived as quiet legends, their names passed like myths to new inmates. "Stay smart," they'd warn. "This place remembers things." One young officer described it perfectly in an interview decades later. "You can feel it when you walk the tiers, that sense that the building knows who's really in charge. You think you're holding the keys, but deep down, you know you're just passing through someone else's history." That's what Leavenworth became, not just a prison, but a living artifact of American punishment. The ripple effect across America. Leavenworth's downfall reshaped U.S. corrections policy more than most people realize. The Supermax era, Marion, Florence ADX, and countless others, was born from Leavenworth's shadow. Washington wanted control it could measure, silence it could enforce. ADX Florence, opened in 1994, was built on one principle: what happened at Leavenworth must never happen again. Total isolation. No gangs. No councils. No communication. But the irony runs deep. The very systems built to prevent inmate empires only magnified the conditions that created them. When you strip men of all connection, hierarchy becomes survival. And in the silence of concrete solitude, influence doesn't disappear, it transforms. Former inmates from Leavenworth, transferred to these new facilities, carried more than scars, they carried systems. Code. Structures. Methods of control. The ghost of Leavenworth became the blueprint of modern American incarceration. The stories that refused to stay buried. In 2016, a retired correctional counselor named Robert Larkin published a memoir titled Behind the Stone Gates. In it, he wrote, "Leavenworth taught me that control is an illusion. You can lock a man away, but you can't contain his mind, not if he's learned to run the system better than you." The book was small, self-published, and largely ignored by mainstream media. But among former inmates, guards, and criminologists, it became something else, a confession written by someone who had seen the empire rise and fall from the inside. Larkin described how inmate leadership had once solved problems faster than staff meetings could. When a fight broke out, the elders intervened before the alarms even sounded. When contraband surfaced, it vanished before the warden heard a whisper. It was, as he called it, criminal order, more efficient than bureaucratic chaos. And perhaps that's what made Leavenworth so dangerous. It showed the world that power doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, behind bars, behind routine, behind obedience. The forgotten empire remembered today, Leavenworth operates as a medium security facility, quieter, calmer, older. The high walls still stand, but their meaning has changed. Tourists occasionally pass the gates without realizing they're looking at the birthplace of the modern prison state. The empire that once ruled those corridors has faded, but its lessons remain etched into every corner of America's correctional landscape. When criminologists discuss self-governing prisons, they point to Leavenworth. When wardens talk about maintaining control, they whisper about Leavenworth. And when reformers argue that punishment without purpose breeds power without accountability, they're describing Leavenworth. Because that fortress wasn't just a building. It was a mirror, reflecting everything America wanted to believe about justice and everything it refused to see. The final echo in 2022, during a rare historical interview, a retired Bureau of Prisons official was asked what Leavenworth had taught him after 30 years of reform efforts. He paused for a long time before answering. Leavenworth wasn't a failure of control, he said. It was a lesson in power. You can cage a man's body. You can silence his voice. But you can never stop the will to organize. The interviewer asked what he meant. He smiled faintly. Every empire leaves an echo. And Leavenworth's still talking. As the camera cut away, the stone walls of Leavenworth stood in the distance, gray, silent, unchanged. But if you listened closely, through the wind and rust, you could almost hear it. The faint rhythm of footsteps, the distant clang of a cell door, the quiet heartbeat of a forgotten empire that once ruled itself. Leavenworth's story isn't over. It's just serving a life sentence inside history itself. White heavy checkmark disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Information is drawn from Bureau of Prisons archives, DOJ reports, court filings, and verified historical accounts.